All right, glad you guys are here today. We had last week off from this message series because of Fifth Sunday, but we're jumping back into the Dreamer today. If you haven't been around for it, I want to kind of quickly get everybody caught up. My expectation is not that anybody remembers exactly where we left off. Also, I want to mention up front that, again, if you haven't been around for the rest of the series, the message handout that's in your worship guide is very different than a normal one. There's a lot more blank space. There aren't fill in the blanks, like specific fill in the blanks. On the back, there's a reading plan that if you want to dig deeper into the stories, into the text this week, you can do that. I have all the chapters listed there. And then there's a place to just jot down, if you decide to do that at home on your own time, there's a place to just jot down any questions, just anything that comes to mind throughout that process. If you're part of a small group, it'd be a great thing to take to your small group, chat with them about something like that. But the notes are very, very different. And the idea is that this series doesn't really lend itself super well to me telling you what it is that I think you should see in the text. Rather, my hope is that based on your own life, your own experiences, your own journey, that you'll see yourself, your journey, you'll see your own kind of thing inside of the story. Essentially, what we're doing in this series is we're looking at the life of one specific character in the Bible, and we're kind of looking at it narratively. One of the things the Bible does exceptionally well is lay out narratives that are very, very powerful. We don't always teach the Bible that way. I don't always teach the Bible that way. But when we approach the Bible as parts of the Bible that are narrative, when we approach them as narrative and try to place ourselves inside the story, what we find is that although these people lived in a very different place, in a very different time, in a very different culture, the conditions of the human heart aren't very much different at all. And so they might have dealt with the kind of the real life implications of their heart in a different way. But the things that motivated them are the same things that motivated us. The things that broke their hearts are the same things that break our hearts. The struggles that they had are the same struggles that we have. And so when we approach it as a narrative, it's this really neat way for the Bible to kind of illuminate us in a different way. And so my hope today is that maybe something that we look at in the narrative will resonate with some part of your story. And I'd rather you write that down than something that I decided that you should know from the text. That make sense? So, all that said, we're in the fourth part of this story. And so, we've walked through it sequentially, and if you haven't been around, let me kind of get you caught up on where we are in the story. In the first week, we met a man named Joseph, a young man of 17. Joseph is one of 12 brothers. He's the second youngest of 12. Joseph's youngest brother we don't meet actually until today, but the other 10 we met in week 1, and they hate Joseph. They hate him for a couple different reasons. One, he's his dad's favorite, and his dad is not shy about it. His dad had, culturally this made sense, obviously we do not do this today, but his dad had several wives, and of those wives, one of them was his favorite. Of that wife, he had 2 sons, Joseph being the older of the 2. And so Jacob's favorite wife had his favorite son. That makes sense? And then his younger brother is the one we're going to meet today, was the other son of that wife, Rachel. When Rachel gave birth to Benjamin, his younger brother, she died. And so Benjamin and Joseph just always held this special place in Jacob's heart. So Joseph was Jacob's favorite. But it wasn't just that. It was also that Jacob often would send Joseph to kind of check on what his brothers were doing. They were all older and they would be out tending sheep. And Jacob would be like, hey, Joseph, go see what they're doing and come back and report on them for me. Which just never parents that's just a parenting 101. Don't have the kids report on the other kids. That doesn't create great dynamics. But then there was another major reason that Jacob's brothers didn't like him. And that was that Jacob had these dreams. And he had these very vivid dreams, and in 2 of the dreams in particular, he dreamed that his brothers were bowing down to him. And then Joseph went and did a stupid thing and told his brothers about these dreams. And so there were kind of all these things over the years that led his brothers to a place where they're like, we just want rid of that guy. We don't want him around anymore. And so eventually Jacob sent Joseph to check on him one time they were out tending sheep. And the brothers, as they saw him coming, devised a plan to kill him. But then, rather than kill him, they decided, well, we don't really gain from that. Let's sell him to these merchants that are on their way through. At least if we sell him as a slave, we'll gain something from that. And so they do. So at 17 years old, Joseph was betrayed by his brothers in just a brutally awful way. He was sold into slavery. Eventually, he ends up in Egypt, where he's sold to a man named Potiphar. And over time, Joseph develops a reputation inside Potiphar's house for being responsible, for being hardworking, for being dependable. And Potiphar elevates Joseph to be in charge of his whole household. And so from being kind of in this terrible valley of like, and how could my brothers do this to me? Joseph is elevated to a position of importance. But then Joseph is accused of something he didn't do and thrown in jail for a crime he didn't commit. And so he goes from a low to a high to a low. While he's in jail, Joseph then has an opportunity to interpret the dreams of a couple of men. At this point, Joseph has again, he's proven himself dependable and trustworthy, and he's been put in charge of all the prisoners in the prison. He essentially can do whatever he wants. And so again, he's kind of back on this high. And then these two guys have dreams, and they say, we don't know what these means, and Joseph is able to interpret the dreams. In one of the dreams, the man is going to be elevated back to his position as Pharaoh's cupbearer. Excuse me. And so Joseph says to him, would you do me a favor? When you're elevated back to your position, would you just remember me? Because I'm in jail for something I didn't do. It's a moment of hope for Joseph. It then goes away quickly as the cupbearer returns to Pharaoh's service and forgets about Joseph, and Joseph stays in prison for 2 more years. And then we, last week, found out that at the end of all this, some incredible things happen. Eventually, Pharaoh has a dream that he can't interpret. He doesn't know what it means. Nobody can interpret it for him. And that's when the cupbearer remembers, hey, there was this guy. Oh, I forgot. There was this guy in prison. He's still there probably. And he interpreted my dream for me, and he was right. I bet he can interpret yours. So Pharaoh calls for Joseph and brings Joseph before him, and Joseph interprets his dreams, and Pharaoh's just taken by the guy. He's impressive, and he speaks well, and he understands what the dream means, and he's got this plan for what the dream means. And Pharaoh decides to put Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. And so we have this man who at the time Joseph was 30 years old. For 13 years walked through this season of lows and highs and extreme lows and extreme highs, and in the end is elevated to one of the most important positions in the entire ancient Near East. The question that I've kind of asked throughout the series is, how does a person survive the kind of betrayal, the kind of injustice that Joseph survived, and not let it consume them? Because for a lot of us, we've been through, to be really honest, we've been through far less than Joseph went through. And we struggle with forgiveness, and we struggle with not letting bitterness grab root, take hold of us. We've suffered far less injustices than Joseph suffered. And yet, Joseph was able to maintain faith in God and not let that stuff consume him. So the question was, why? 2 weeks ago, we as we looked at the story of Joseph being elevated to this position in Pharaoh's kingdom in Egypt, I tried to answer that a little bit. We looked back at the narrative from part 1 to part 3 and said, hey, what are the consistent things that we see throughout Joseph's life? What are the things that he does that we can reflect on that maybe took him to this place? But then we ended by me asking a question. That question was, what do you do when the ghosts of your past come back? Because the reality is, it's very, very easy to do what Joseph did. Joseph kept his eyes fixed on God throughout this process. Again, I laid out kind of why I think that is, so I won't rehash all of it. But it's pretty clear to me that Joseph, rather than fixing his eyes on his problems, on the betrayal, on the injustice, on these things, Joseph kept his eyes fixed on God. And as a result, he kept moving forward instead of staying stuck where he was. But that's easy when things are good. It's really easy when things are good. The problem is that for all of us, even when things are really, really good, they don't stay there. There comes some point where things fall apart. There comes some point where bad things happen again. Or in Joseph's case, there comes a point where the ghosts from his past circle back around in a very unexpected way. Now, for us as people, the temptation of our hearts is when someone has hurt us, when someone has wronged us, when someone has done something that is unjust to us, especially when those hurts and those wounds are very, very deep. The temptation is, when the ghosts come back, to take revenge. It's to take matters into our own hands and to control the situation and bring about our own sense of justice in the midst of injustice. And that's a choice that Joseph is going to be faced with today. So, we're going to pick up the story in Genesis chapter 42. Again, just to get the context right, Joseph at this point is second in command in all of Egypt. There's a famine in the land. There's been a famine for 7 years. At the end of those 7 years, this was the dream Pharaoh had. At the end of those 7 years, there was 7 years of abundance in Egypt. And after those 7 years, there then began a period of 7 years of famine. Now, Joseph knows this is coming, and Pharaoh knows it's coming. And so Joseph made this plan, and during the 7 years of abundance, the Egyptians stored up grain and stored up grain and stored up grain, and they rationed it so that there would be food for the famine. But people elsewhere didn't know that this was going to happen, and so they didn't store up grain. So when the famine hits, Egypt is flushed with food when no one else has any. And Joseph's family, his dad and his brothers up the road, they don't have any food either. And that kind of brings us to our story in Genesis chapter 42. So picking up right in verse 1. Now, just like every other week in this series, we're covering a lot of scripture, so I'm going to move through it fairly quickly. I'll give some, interjections throughout, but we're going to move a little bit today. Genesis chapter 42, starting in verse 1. When Jacob, Joseph's father, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." Then 10, that's an important number, then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan also. So very quickly, again, the language here is a touch confusing. Joseph has 10 half-brothers and one full brother. So when it says the brothers went, and then it says, but Benjamin, Joseph's brother, that's what it's referencing. They were all brothers, but they were different status of brothers in a sense. And then also it refers to Jacob as both Jacob and Israel. That's the same person. Different names, same person. So they go down. Verse 6, now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." That, again, briefly, that might seem odd to you that Joseph recognized them, but they didn't recognize him. Keep in mind that at this point, Joseph was most likely somewhere in the range of 40-ish years old. His brothers sold him into slavery when he was 17. Now, I don't know about you, but I look a little different today than I did when I was 17. If you want some good laughs, you can ask. I'm more than happy to provide some pictures that you will enjoy. I was about 70 pounds lighter, didn't have a beard, I looked a lot different. Additionally, in this case, Joseph was a governor of Egypt, which means that he would have been decked out in full-on like Egyptian royal attire, probably including even makeup on his face. So they didn't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And Joseph, in this moment, decides that he's going to do some things. So he says, "You're spies. You've come to see where our land is unprotected." Picking up in verse 10, they respond, "No, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies." I'm not going to interject this much throughout the rest, but real quick. These are moments where I think it's helpful to put yourself in the narrative. These are the guys that sold Joseph to traders. They're like, no, we're honest men. If you're Joseph, are you buying that for 1 second? No. And Joseph doesn't buy it. He says, "No, you have come to see where our land is unprotected." But they replied, "Your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man, who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." And Joseph said to them, "It's just as I told you, you are spies. And this is how you'll be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. So send one of your number to go get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you're telling the truth. If you're not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And he put them all in custody for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, Let one of your brothers stay here in prison. I'll send the rest back. You can take grain to your starving households, but you must bring your youngest brother to me so that your words may be verified and that you may not die." This they proceeded to do. In what's coming up, I want you again to take a moment and to, for those of you that are imaginative, for those of you that enjoy reading, this won't be difficult for you, but I want you to take a moment and try to really place yourself in this story. Because we're about to feel the tension and the pain of Joseph in a very powerful way. Verse 21, "Then they said to each other, 'Surely we are being punished because of our brother.'" And they're referring to Joseph. "We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we wouldn't listen. And that's why this distress has come on us." And then Reuben, who's the oldest brother, replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy, but you wouldn't listen? Now we must give an accounting for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand them because he was using an interpreter. Verse 24, "He turned away from them and began to weep, but then came back and spoke to them again." So again, place yourself in this moment. Here's this guy who for 23, 25 years hasn't seen his brothers who sold him at 17 years old. And all at once, out of nowhere, they're right in front of him. The dreams that he had about them bowing down have come true. They're saying, "We're honest men," and he starts to test them, and he's hearing them. They don't know that he can understand. He's hearing them talk about what a huge mistake they made. And he begins to weep. But he's also not dumb. And so he doesn't buy into it, instead, he continues the test. Picking back up in verse 25, "He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to put each man's silver back in his sack of grain and to give them provisions for the journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left." Now, to be clear, Joseph gave his servants orders to do this. The brothers didn't know that the silver had been returned. So verse 27, "At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and he saw his silver in the mouth of his sack. 'My silver has been returned,' he said to his brothers. 'Here it is in my sack.' Their hearts sank as they turned to each other, trembling, and said, 'What is this that God has done to us?' So at this point, Joseph has sprung the first part of his trap. He sent the brothers home with grain, but he's put the money right back in the grain sack. This is an important detail because, again, keep in mind, Joseph said right up front, he said that he was going to test them. He said, "You're going to be tested. We're going to find out if you're honest men." And for Joseph, what he wants to know is, has this quarter of a decade changed you at all? Again, they still don't know it's him, but he wants to know, I don't want to know what words you're saying. I want to know what you do. I want to know what you do. And so the brothers at this point have a decision to make. Are they going to be honest men? Well, they return to their father Jacob, and they tell him everything that's happened. They say, "Hey, we met this man down there. He sold us grain, but it was weird, Dad. Like, he asked us all about our family, and he really asked a lot about Benjamin, and he asked a lot about you. And then he said we were liars and we were spies. We tried to convince him that we weren't. But he said that he wanted to make sure we weren't, so he said he was going to keep one of the brothers, like you probably noticed Simeon isn't with us. So he kept Simeon, and he sent us back, but then the strangest thing happened. Dad, we didn't steal the money, but it's in our sacks. And he told us that we can't come back unless we bring Benjamin. Dad, we gotta go get Simeon back. We gotta take Benjamin back so we can get Simeon." And Jacob says, "Absolutely not." He says, "No, you're not taking Benjamin." In fact, Jacob makes this appeal to them, and he says, "Listen, your brother Joseph was my heart, and he's gone. If I lose Benjamin too, I'll die. I won't survive it. You're not taking Benjamin with you." Which, is a little bit of a side note. Like, you can start to see why maybe the brothers didn't like Joseph too much, leave Simeon in prison. I don't want to lose that one. But he says, no, it's not going to happen. And so the family eats the food, and we don't know how long it took, but however long it took, they ate the food, and eventually they ran out. And the brothers go back to Jacob, and they say, Dad, we got to go back to Egypt. We're out of food. And the Egyptians are the only ones that have food. And Jacob says, fine, go. And they're like, we need Benjamin. Like that guy told us if we show back up without Benjamin, he's going to kill all of us. And Jacob says, no, you're not taking Benjamin. And finally, Judah, one of the brothers, steps up and he says, Dad, we got to go back and we got to take Benjamin with us. Dad, listen, I know what happened with Joseph was bad. Keep in mind, Jacob doesn't know what happened with Joseph. He thinks he's dead. All these years. He says, Dad, we know what happened with Joseph was bad. I'll take care of Benjamin. On my life, Dad, I'll bring him back to you, no matter what. And Jacob says, okay, I guess if we don't do this, we're all going to starve to death anyway. But you're going to take the money back, and you're going to take extra money back, and you're going to take gifts, because those guys think you stole from them. So you need them to know you didn't. The brothers say, okay, great. We'll pick back up there in Genesis chapter 43, verse 15. So the men took gifts and double the amount of silver, and Benjamin also. They hurried down to Egypt and presented themselves to Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin was with them, he said to the steward of his house, take these men to my house, slaughter an animal, and prepare a meal. They are to eat with me at noon. So the man did as Joseph told him, and took all the men to Joseph's house. Now the men were frightened when they were taken to his house. They thought, we were brought here because of the silver that was put back in our sacks the first time. He wants to attack us and overpower us and seize us as slaves and take our donkeys. So they went up to Joseph's steward, and they spoke to him at the entrance of the house. We beg your pardon, our lord, they said. We came down here the first time to buy food, but at the place we stopped for the night, we opened our sacks and we found our silver, the exact weight in the mouth of our sacks. So we brought it back with us, all of it. And we also brought additional silver with us to buy food. We don't know who put that silver in our sacks. And this is actually a pretty critical moment in the story because, again, keep in mind, Joseph wants to know if his brothers are honest. They said we're honest men. Well, typically, when we're confronted with something bad that we've done, we've got one of two responses, right? We either bring it to light or we hide it in the dark. The brothers could have taken their chances and just left the silver. But they didn't. They brought it back. And they even take the initiative to say, hey, we don't know what happened, but here's all the silver, and here's more silver. They're owning up. This is a big step in what's to come, but at this point, it's still not enough. It's all right, the steward said. Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you the treasure in your sacks. I received your silver. And then he brought Simeon out to them. Now, at this point, the brothers are probably like, okay, we're getting there. It's getting better. But it's going to change in a bit. Now, the steward took the men into Joseph's house. He gave them water to wash their feet and provided fodder for their donkeys. They prepared their gifts for Joseph's arrival at noon because they had heard that they were to eat there. When Joseph came home, they presented him the gifts they had brought into the house, and they bowed down before him to the ground. He asked them how they were. And then he said, how is your aged father that you told me about? Is he still living? They replied, your servant, our father, is still alive and well. And they bowed down, prostrating themselves before him. As he looked about and saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about? He said, God be gracious to you, my son. And again, in this moment, you can feel the weight of Joseph's emotion. Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and he wept there. Again, just a small piece of context. When Joseph was sold, he was 17. We don't know exactly how much younger Benjamin was than Joseph, but most guesses are that he was probably 5-ish years younger than Joseph. So Joseph hasn't seen his brother Benjamin since he was 12-ish years old. He would have been a little boy. And now Benjamin is probably 35. I imagine Joseph didn't like his other brothers very much at all. But Joseph loved Benjamin. And after almost a quarter century, he's looking at his brother in the face, completely overwhelmed that he's there. Verse 31, after he'd washed his face, that's how hard the guy was crying, he came out and, controlling himself, said, serve the food. They served him by himself, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for that is detestable to the Egyptians. The men had been seated before him in order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest. And they looked at each other in astonishment. Joseph's playing tricks on him. He's playing a mind game. They didn't ask how old the brothers were, and Joseph just put them in age order. These are guys that are like 55 to 40. I mean, like, I'm pretty good at guessing people's ages, like roughly, but I couldn't get a string of 10 people in order. And Joseph, I have to imagine, like, again, let's humanize him for a minute. He's probably like, watch this. No, really. These guys are gonna be like, what's going on? He's like, you sit there, and he puts some age order straight down the line. Then when the portions were served to them from Joseph's table, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as anyone else's. So they feasted and drank freely with him. That line is a line that confused me for most of my life. Benjamin's portions were 5 times what anyone else's were. I guess for most of my life, I just kind of made the assumption, like, well, Benjamin was Joseph's favorite because, like, the other one sold him into slavery, so probably like Benjamin better, right? But I don't think that's what was going on here. I think there's actually something far bigger that's going on here. Now, if we take a step back, when Joseph was 17, his brothers sold him. Why? Because he was their dad's favorite. He was the favored son, and it was abundantly obvious. And the brothers got jealous. So they get rid of this guy. So what does Joseph do? Joseph gives them a new favorite to betray. Remember, Joseph wants to know, are these guys honest? Because I know what they did to me. They sold me because my dad liked me the most. So I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to like one the most, and I'm going to make it real obvious. And I'm going to give my brothers an opportunity to do to Benjamin exactly what they did to me. And we'll find out if they're honest or not. And I think as we continue the story, you'll see that that is exactly what Joseph was doing. Genesis chapter 44, starting in verse 1. Now Joseph gave these instructions to the steward of his house. Fill them in sacks with as much food as they can carry, and put each man's silver in the mouth of his sack. So he's going to run the same trick on again. Then put my cup, the silver one, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, along with the silver for his grain. Take my expensive silver royal chalice, put it in Benjamin's sack. Benjamin's the youngest. And the steward did as Joseph said. As morning dawned, the men were sent on their way with the donkeys. They had not gone far from the city when Joseph said to his steward, go after those men at once, and when you catch up with them, say to them, why have you repaid good with evil? Isn't this the cup my master drinks from and also uses for divination? This is a wicked thing you have done. When he caught up with them, he repeated those words to them. But they said to him, why does my Lord say such things? Far be it from your servants to do anything like that. We even brought back to you from the land of Canaan the silver we found inside the mouth of our sacks. So why would we steal silver or gold from your master's house? If any of your servants is found to have it, he will die, and the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves. Very well then, he said, let it be as you say. Whoever is found to have it will become my slave, and the rest of you will be free from blame. That's an important line, because they say, we'll all pay if somebody did it. The steward says, no, we don't need you all to pay, just the one who did something wrong. Who's the one that did something wrong? Benjamin. Well, not really. Each of them quickly lowered his sack to the ground and opened it. Then as the steward proceeded to search, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. At this, they tore their clothes. Then they all loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. This is an important moment. Joseph has set up a scenario where the brothers are isolated in the wilderness, which sounds an awful like what happened in the first story. He set up a scenario where the favorite son has done something wrong. And the steward has given the brothers an out. He said, no, whoever's the one that did something wrong, I'll take him back. The rest of you can go. And then it's found that it's Benjamin. What did the brothers do? They could have just turned their back on Benjamin. They could have gone back to Jacob and said, Dad, we don't understand what happened. But they arrested Benjamin. They just took him. And there was nothing that we could do. And it would have been a believable story. But instead, the brothers tear their clothes, which in this culture would have been, it was a sign of mourning. The brothers are heartbroken. They are distraught. Because at this point, what they believe is that either Benjamin is going to die or Benjamin is going to be put in prison. And in either case, when our dad finds out, it will kill him. It will literally kill him, and we will watch our father die at our hands because we killed his 2 sons. So they go back. They return to the city. Joseph was still in the house when Judah and his brothers came in, and they threw themselves to the ground before him. And Joseph said to them, what is this you have done? Don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination? What can we say to my Lord? Judah replied, what can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my Lord's slaves. And then watch what Judah says. He says, we ourselves and the one who is found to have the cup. The brothers aren't betraying Benjamin. They're sticking with him. But Joseph said, far be it from me to do such a thing. Only the man who is found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you, go back to your father in peace. And for the final time, Joseph sets a trap. And again, gives the brothers, he hands Benjamin to him on a platter. The rest of you can go. I'm only taking him. And all the brothers have to do is go, okay, so if we do this, we live. If we don't do this, we're all slaves here. Seems like a good trade-off. But Judah steps up in this moment and for the final time proves to Joseph that they are in fact changed men. Verse 18, then Judah went up to him and said, pardon your servant, my lord. Let me speak a word to my lord. Do not be angry with your servant, though you were equal to Pharaoh himself. My lord asked his servants, do you have a father or a brother? And we answered. And like, again, if you're a person who uses your imagination and puts yourself inside stories, I imagine you can feel the tension and the pressure of this moment. When I read this, I think, Judah says, you asked this question and we answered like, we didn't even have to tell you about our brother, but we did. Like, we were honest with you. Just he's begging. We answered, we have an aged father, and there is a young son born to him in his old age. His one brother is dead, and he is the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him. And then you said to your servants, my iPad jumped. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me so I can see him for myself. And we said, the boy can't leave his father. If he leaves him, his father will die. But you told us, unless your brother comes down with you, you won't see my face again. So when we went back to your servant, my father, we told him what my Lord had said. And then our father said, go back and buy a little more food. But we said we can't. Only if you let us take our youngest brother. Can't see that man's face unless he's with us. And so your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away from me, and I said, he has surely been torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. Again, 25 years. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in misery. So now, if the boy is not with us, when I go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I don't bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all of my life. So please take me. Please take me instead of him. Let him go home. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? Please don't make me see the misery that would come on him. And that's where we're going to end today. In this moment, Joseph has all the power. Joseph is looking at these men, these grown men, who, by the way, were mostly grown men when they sold him a quarter of a century earlier. He's looking at them in the face. And again, if we humanize Joseph in this moment, you got to be thinking, okay, I've been testing them, and they have passed every single one of the tests. Judah didn't stand up for me before. Judah didn't offer to take my place. They took my coat home and gave it to Dad and told him that I had been torn to pieces by animals. But now they're standing with Benjamin in a way that they didn't stand for me. The evidence says they're changed. The evidence says they've learned from what they've done. The evidence says that they are honest men who have learned from the terrible mistake that they made. But it doesn't change the fact that they sold their brother. It doesn't change the fact that Joseph has been carrying the wounds and the pain of being sold by his brothers for 25 years. And it doesn't change the fact that now Joseph has the power to do anything that he wants, and they can't do a thing about it. And it's an interesting reversal, isn't it? From Joseph being in the bottom of a well, pleading with his brothers, begging them for his life, and them saying, nope, to them now pleading with him. They still don't know it's him. The question is, will Joseph continue to do what he has done? Will he continue to surrender control over to God? Will he continue to trust God for the results? Or will he grab for control? And will he grab the vengeance that he very rightfully could carry out on his brothers? Because could you blame him? but we're going to figure that out next week. When I planned this series, I do want you to know, like I know I'm ending on a big cliffhanger, but when I planned this series, I planned it because of one specific verse that we're going to read next week. The whole series has been leading to this. And it's a verse that I think is one of the most important in all of the Bible, if I were ranking. Not that you really should, but if I were. That I think is one of the most important. Because again, the circumstances, the context might be different. But we all understand what it's like to be betrayed by people that should love us and care for us. We all understand what it's like to be in a position where people who should be the ones that protect us instead hand out brutal injustice against us. We have all had things in our lives that we've had to try to sift through and go, how do I survive this? Because it's not okay. And it's in Joseph's life and in his response next week that I think holds the key to it all. So don't read ahead. I mean, you can, but you'll ruin it. And I'm really excited about next week. So please don't. Please. Let me pray for us.